Hey everyone, welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast, your one stop for practical and useful clinical information, masterful insights from experts in the field, and a guide to daily living. I'm Ray Christner, and with me,
Paul Wagner.
So Paul, we kind of took a shift today. We went out of mental health and really focused on something much more academic.
And, I felt slightly out of my element here, but, not being a school psych, but, there was a bit of a fly on the wall feeling, but just hearing just such good information and information that, I do think translates really well as a practitioner, both kind of the direct content, but as well as like some of the processes that, our guest was talking about. It was really insightful.
Yeah. So, I mean, the topic of the day was literacy, and I think that is, it's kind of interesting because when we started, it was just to learn about literacy, but I think the tie back into mental health was so important.
Yeah.
And to hear, the struggles that people go through as adults when they do have illiteracy and how that impacts just everything from self-esteem to just quality of life. And maybe more important to me is the fact that we really hit on some ideas of how we can maybe solve this problem of illiteracy.
Megan, one thing that I think really this episode did well is, and please check our show description because we're going to have a plethora of resources. And, she just put out such good information and hoping that, it can be applicable for our listeners who are in academia or who are in the school system, as well as just clinicians that are interested in learning more about how to promote literacy.
Yeah. And so, you mentioned, so our guest was Dr. Megan Gierka. And so for people who maybe don't know her, she is a Pennsylvania native, and she's a senior content developer for AIM Institute. And prior to that, Megan was involved as a reading specialist and a literacy coach. And she really is this advocate for literacy. And if you search her name, you can watch some of her testimony here in Pennsylvania to the Senate and really, really showing her expertise in that area.
I think one of my takeaways from this conversation was, she had a story, and I won't steal the thunder of her story because it's just the way she describes it is just, really, really impactful. But, she talks about the impact that it can have on an adult, and, right. It's a very specific story, but I think it's a generalized experience that talks about, when we don't have some of these foundational skills in literacy, the impact that it has, and then the efforts we go through to try to mask or to try to pass in public because we have this insecurity and this fear of, being perceived in this way. And, just comes back again of the importance and significance of promoting literacy and promoting, good interventions early on that work.
Yeah. And, I think that story is powerful, and you all are going to hear that right early on in the episode, because it really kind of was a catalyst for, I think, all that she's doing in her career. Yeah. So, it's a great story. And, for me, you mentioned she just, gosh, what an amazing memory for research. And it seemed like every question she was able to just, here's a book, here's an article, which I love talking to guests like that. And, so I think kind of my takeaway this week is maybe just a real simple piece. And she used the term that we have to continually follow the evidence. And, that idea of following the evidence to good structured literacy programs and interventions, how important that is, and something that we really need to see schools getting on board with to kind of work through this problem. So great episode, different than what we've done. But, even somebody who does work with reading, I felt like I learned a lot as well.
And with that, we hope you enjoyed this practice in action episode, Improving Literacy.
Megan, welcome to the Psych to Practice podcast. We're so glad you can join us tonight.
I'm so happy to be here. Nice to see you again, Ray. And Paul, nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you as well.
So our last encounter, I was just so impressed by your work around reading. We felt like we really had to have you on here to kind of share kind of your experience in literacy and maybe how we address this in general. It's just such a big issue. So this is the first time I think we've had an academic specific topic on. So I'm excited to do it this evening.
I'm super excited. This is my favorite topic, and hopefully I don't bore your people, but I get real jazzed up. So as you know,
I don't know. When you were presenting, you were all over the room. I don't know how you're going to do that tonight, but we'll figure it out. So Megan, as we kind of start, we like to have our audience get to know our guests a little bit. So tell us a little bit about how did you get into the field of education, and then specifically taking this deep dive into reading?
Yeah, sure. So I'm that classic example of a teacher who had an amazing teacher that just inspired and motivated me. So I come to you guys as a military brat and a first gen, and I had an amazing third grade teacher, Mr. Y, as I frankly call him, but he really saw a lot of potential in me, kind of helped me navigate my little class clown ways, and really helped me develop a fire for academics and just like every great intellectual and social conversation that we had in third grade really resonated. I don't want to age you guys, but third grade was when I experienced 9/11. So as a dad who was a soldier, who was getting ready to deploy and all the ramifications of that, I had a very special bond with that class and that teacher. And I just think I always stayed very close with him. He was even at my college graduation when I gave my commencement address, and we've stayed close all those years. So it really speaks to the power that one teacher can have on a person, because anytime someone asks, like, why did you get into that? I think about him. I think about how he inspired me and helped me. And I hope to be that for my students that I've taught over the years. As far as reading goes, I really don't think that I was really jazzed about reading ever, in elementary, high school. I was that person who was on Spark Notes all the time, just kind of feeling out those essays. But I think what really jazzed it is when I started teaching kindergarten my first year and realized I had no idea how to teach this very important foundational skill. And my students were really, really struggling. So that really ignited a fire. And as far as illiteracy goes and where that came from, I don't know if I've shared this story with you guys before, but I was actually working as a reading specialist not far from Harrisburg. And I had a family who just wouldn't get back to me. Y'all know how that is as psychologists. Like, they don't return the paperwork.
Yeah. Right.
So finally, I run into her of all places at Walmart, and I'm like, girl, I've been looking for you. Like, why are you ignoring me? I've seesawed her. I dojoed her. I like called the pigeon, everything. And she was avoiding me all over Walmart. Finally, I got my card into her. I was like, girl, I need you. I need to help your kid. You need to sign this paper. And she finally admitted to me right there in the dairy aisle that she struggled with reading herself. And I was very, kind of immune to this problem of illiteracy. And I knew students struggled, but I couldn't fathom a world where adults struggled. And right there in that moment, she showed me on her phone an app that she uses called Be My Eyes. It's actually for people who struggle who have low vision or who are blind. And she uses this app, pretends to be blind, and it connects you via FaceTime with someone with sight. And that's how she reads government documents. That's how she does her job as an insurance adjuster, just using this app to get through life. And I think that really sparked wow, this very successful, prominent woman found the most creative way to get around this major problem. And I realized that she wasn't alone. And I think that really started a fire in me, and I haven't stopped since.
So, what an interesting story, because it shows somebody who's sounds like fairly successful in her own career, but really doing some workarounds to get there. And then maybe you as a teacher chasing people down in Walmart. That's a whole other part of the story. So that goes above and beyond, Megan.
We gotta do what we gotta do,
That's right. So when we're talking about this idea of illiteracy, so when we think about reading, we always think about kids, but your your example that what got you into this and kind of inspired you comes from an adult. So how big of a problem are we talking about when we talk about illiteracy?
So as you can imagine, Ray, I did go down that rabbit hole. So, after that encounter, I'm like, she can't be alone. She can't possibly be the only adult I've ever encountered like this. And I stumbled upon the Barbara Bush Foundation. They have something, it'd probably be cool to include in your show notes, called the Literacy Gap Map. And you can look county by county across the United States and see the adult proficiency rates where you live. So I was teaching in a more affluent suburb of Harrisburg. So I figured, it can't be that bad here. And even in that area, 1 in 5 adults struggled to acquire any basic skills, like 3rd, 4th grade level proficiency. And across the country, over half of our population would not be able to read and understand a middle school textbook. We're at 54 to 56%, I believe the statistic is. So more of our population struggles with literacy than not, which was very jarring.
Wow. Yeah. It's amazing to think of that. And then to think of how much we rely on it. It's a skill we just have to have. So so what are some of the common challenges you see with school children? So, this idea of struggling to reach proficiency in reading, what's that struggle like for kids?
So it starts early. There's so much research on, how we got to this problem, and I'm happy to address that. But when you're sitting in front of a child who's struggling with reading, you're seeing mass issues. I was actually just chatting yesterday with a mom whose child has severe mental health issues because his dyslexia has kind of slid under the radar for years. I was just last week working at a school in Ohio and talking with an 8th grade student who only understood 8 different letters and letter sound combinations and slid under the radar for all those years. These are students that sometimes, might act as a class clown to get out of class, so they don't have to be there and kind of feel embarrassed by their peers. And these are also those students who are reclusive and stay very close, struggling to have those friendships and relationships, largely because they don't feel worthy. They don't get this gift of literacy that seemingly appeared so easy for their friends to get. And now they don't feel worthy of other things in their life. And we see that having major mental health effects, as we've seen in schools, especially after the pandemic. Just seeing that mental health side of things really play a toll. I think what's even harder is, we're seeing promising legislation, but for years, these kids were able to fly under the radar because our assessments were ineffective, our curriculum was ineffective, and teachers didn't have the knowledge to know what those red flags were to look for. Like, what should we expect for a kindergarten or 1st grader? And they didn't understand what those metrics were. So there was a lot of missing research, I think, from the teacher side of things, and parents believing their kid was just going to grow out of it. And there's a lot of different misconceptions that kind of got us to where we are.
And I certainly hear how, whether it's with some of the kiddos that you're talking about, or that, the parent that you were able to connect with in Walmart, the impact of shame, and then that response that says, I need to hide this. I need this to be something that no one knows about. And so not only necessarily maybe flying under the radar, but, they're not wanting to be on the radar. They are actively trying to avoid or accommodate, for this woman to find this way of working around it. And if we can work so hard to find a way to kind of mask or pass, and, in terms of the school system, or even in, beyond that, in careers and fields like that, how then that, if we put that effort into engaging, especially at an early point, I can imagine it can then make a strong difference, but we're needing to kind of address it a bit more directly because it wasn't recognized before.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you see the effects later on, but knowing that we can solve this problem largely in kindergarten, 1st grade is a huge, wow factor. One of the big things that I think people don't realize, we're talking about students and their mental health, but teachers weren't prepared on how to handle this. There was just a great study, National Council of Teacher Quality in 2023. I think it was June, they published their findings that 70+% of teacher prep programs are failing to address how to teach reading. So, they're entering a system that they're not very good at. And then teachers feel shame when their students aren't doing well. Every teacher wants their students to succeed. And then when they don't succeed, teachers feel that shame too.
Yeah, that's such a profound kind of study, though. I mean, to think about how difficult that is for teachers that are in that position where they don't have the resources. And, we hear all these kind of catchwords that people throw out there, and there's all these different programs. We hear all this stuff about the science of reading. So what's that mean? So for people who aren't familiar with hearing that term, and I've heard it in even, in politics, we're hearing people talk about the science of reading. What does that actually mean for teachers?
So glad you brought this up. The science of reading is really just kind of a fancy term to describe the convergence of evidence where, we're finally listening to psychologists like yourself. We're listening to the researchers, the speech pathologists, and really aligning that convergence of evidence on what we know works. Largely, a lot of it is totally settled. We know how students acquire these skills. And it's really just putting those findings into practice. The research to practice gap is almost 20 years. We're sitting at over 20 years since the National Reading Panel delivered that seminal report on how to teach reading. So that was in 2000, and we're still kind of waiting and starting to see an uptick in legislation. I prefer the term structured literacy because I think it provides some metrics around it. So the science of reading is really just describing all of that evidence, and the structured literacy is how we're going to teach those evidence-aligned principles. So that's really looking at explicit instruction, systematic, sequential, cumulative instruction, and really using high quality evidence aligned instructional materials rather than something people are buying on Teachers Pay Teachers. I can tell you I was a Teachers Pay Teachers queen and probably would have taken out a loan if they would have let me buy things on there because I didn't have anything. And now that I know a lot about the structured literacy, the psychology and the science of reading, I've definitely shifted to a more high quality approach rather than just whatever I could Google online.
So I don't know if this is going to be an easy question to answer, but let's say we have parents out there listening and they want to know if their child's getting good reading instruction. How can they tell?
Great question. So you will see, just like when the Common Core standards were aligned, every curriculum and their brother put out the sticker aligned to Common Core standards. Same thing is happening with science of reading, aligned to the science of reading. So it's hard to tell on a district website and sometimes even some of the curricular choices if it is aligned. But in regards to student progress, one of the most important things to look out for is their progress on something called a universal screening assessment. So those are assessments like DIBELS, Ames Web, FastBridge is used very locally in the area, Acadience, M-Class. But these are assessments that are given 3 times a year that are aligned to national norms. So how well is your child performing on these key indicators of national normed assessments, particularly in regards to fluency and nonsense word decoding? Most schools administer them. There's actually legislation right now in Pennsylvania that's pending in the Senate to actually require it as law here in our state, but many other states I work with already have it written into law. I actually just met with the Maryland State Department yesterday, Ohio State Department. It's already written into their code that these types of assessments are given and families are notified. So definitely ask for the results on that universal screening measure and the norms associated. So you psychologists love norms. Teachers are finally learning what those are. And they had never really learned or heard and used that language before. So being able to digest that for parents to know, is my child on track with these key indicators? We think of it like blood work. You go to the doctor and get your blood work. Same idea with these DIBELS assessments or Acadience assessments. Is your child where they should be at their current grade level based on these norms? The other thing I would definitely say, and I've heard a lot from teachers, is just this common notion that these young children and these young readers are going to grow out of it. Oh, they're just immature, or, oh, COVID happened and they're still struggling with attention. There is convergence of research that shows that we can hit this by kindergarten, early first grade. And Torgeson and a lot of other landmark studies have shown that if we don't remedy these effects and these students who are struggling by the end of first grade, over 80% of them never catch up. So we need to ask these questions early of our kindergarten and first grade teachers to make sure that our students are making that progress and closing that gap as early as possible.
I'm going to keep putting you on the spot. So, I want to go back to the assessments, because I think that, I hear parents and even I think some teachers that get confused about what's good universal screenings. So I have parents go, well, it's, the PSSA is a screening. And I say, well, no, it's really not. That's not the purpose. But, we hear terms like running records or F&P assessments and all these different things. Is there a standard that sets those screenings apart, or are they all on the same playing field?
Oh, such a good question. So if you're that parent or even that teacher, a great website, the National Center for Intensive Intervention. It's actually funded by the Institute of Educational Sciences, which is through the federal government, but they have a list of all effective screening tools on their website. And I'd be happy to share that tells you what evidence is behind each of these tools. But when you're thinking of universal screeners, those critical assessments, they're given about 2, but most likely 3 times a year. They are quick and rapid. I mean, they're taking only like 3 to 5 minutes per child. And it is not tied to something that is being taught in class. It is something that they couldn't practice at home. It is something that really is just those indicators of risk to see where that child is. It's not really something you could study for or test prep for like a PSSA. In regards to F&P and DRA leveled assessments, those terms, levels, like if we've seen a lot of, oh, your child is a level M, great job, or they're a DRA 14, excellent. Those terms are actually completely arbitrary and made up. They do not align to anything other than a publisher's recommendation. Matt Burns out of University of Florida just did a really great study. I believe it when he was still at Missouri, but his study showed that those measures of leveled reading for early literacy have the same effect as flipping a coin in determining a child's reading struggles. So really, if you're going to be using that, just flip a coin instead, because it seemed just as reliable, where those universal screening measures are almost proportionally tied to how well that child is going to do later on.
So we're talking about these screening measures. When we're talking about like these underlying factors that we're screening for, what are those underlying factors that contribute to someone either being a good reader or struggling with reading?
Yeah, great question. So we have a lot of neuroscience that we can point to in this as well. And a lot of students who have a reading difficulty present mostly in the phonological processor of their brain, which is Broca's area. So a lot of it really does go back to that most basic level of phonemic awareness, being able to blend and segment words. Cat into k-at is a very important early literacy skill. We spend so much time talking and students are exposed to this rich oral discourse. And then they come to school and they're expected to kind of chop things up like robots. But it's a very important skill to kind of play with and get students ready for. The other big important screening tool is something called nonsense word decoding. And that's being able to take a word that makes no sense, like Jev, like J-E-V, and being able to decode that word using phonics skills. So it's a word that a student doesn't have in their sight word vocabulary, a totally new word, but being able to tell if they have acquired the skill we're trying to teach them. The other very, very, very critical piece here is oral reading fluency. Oral reading fluency is actually tied to comprehension even more than a lot of the comprehension measures. So how well a student's able to read that passage is likely how well they're going to be able to comprehend it. And those measures are so, so critical when we're looking at student success. Leveled passages and leveled texts, like we shared, do not have that correlation and do not predict that. And even those leveled texts actually hold students back, and it's considered an inequitable practice to assess and instruct in that way.
So if we have parents out there who are realizing that their children are having some struggles in reading, whether it be just, the struggle of maybe they don't want to do their homework, or we're seeing this as, on screening measures. What are some ideas that you might have that parents can do to try to support their kids in this process?
Yeah, really great question. Another great resource I can share with you. My colleague, Tiffany Peltier, really great friend of mine. She was a researcher at University of Oklahoma. She created a great one-page teacher-friendly tool that I would love to share with you guys. But really, it's figuring out what that child's need is. So generally, there's word recognition, language comprehension. Students who struggle with reading usually struggle with both because of that Matthew effect. When it comes to word recognition, it's being able to figure out what is that phonics skill that they're learning in class, and being able to blend and segment the sounds in those words, read and write those words that align to that pattern, and then reading decodable texts that align to really practice that. So imagine a child is in class all day learning a phonics skill. Maybe it's consonant digraphs, but then they're reading a text that has nothing to do with the patterns they just taught. So it's like sitting in driver's ed all day. Now they need to drive the car to see if they learned those skills. That's kind of what decodable texts are, to help students acquire that accuracy as well as that automaticity of those patterns that are taught in class. But that's just one side of a very important equation. We also have that language comprehension piece. That's being able to play with words and understand the meanings of words, not only at the word level, but at that sentence level too. So many students struggle with that syntactic awareness. So being able to take out some of those meatier sentences and digest them. What are those clauses? What are those cohesive elements within that sentence that can really help us understand? There's a lot of research out there about background knowledge too, and how important that is, that we shouldn't just be reading texts that students are interested in. Like, when I was a teacher, I remember I'd look at my students' surveys and it would say about, my kid loves dinosaurs. So I used to think, great, I'm going to teach more dinosaurs. They're going to be so jazzed up. But really, I was creating a problem, because by the time they got to middle school and they were learning about World War II, they had no background knowledge because I was only teaching to their interests. So really making sure we integrate those rich knowledge building experiences that can be vertically aligned to. And parents can contribute to that in so many ways, whatever they're learning, continuing to find little articles and things in the current world that align to what they're learning in class. Smithsonian has virtual field trips. If you can't get to a museum, they're all free. They are awesome online. My students love them. And just engaging in conversation. I am just as guilty. I am an aunt, and sometimes my niece drives me bananas. So I give her the iPad because she's driving me nuts. But, I know that's not always best practice. We really want to engage in great conversation. And Sonia Cabell just released a really great book for parents and teachers alike about how to engage in that conversation. And it's called Strive for 5. So basically, a teacher asks a question or a parent asks a question, the student responds, the teacher responds back either with a scaffold up, like to help them elaborate on that answer, or a scaffold down. The student responds, and then the teacher responds again. Really looking for 5 turns in a normal conversation rather than just a parent asking a question, child or student answers, the end. It's really that engaging in dialogue that's going to help build that comprehension as well.
And when you're sharing, especially your comment there about being an aunt and, at times handing over the iPad, I can't help but wonder if there's what the research says about the impact of technology and how that's changed the technology. It can read to us. It can do these different things. And I'm curious, has there been any findings there of what that impact is in terms of literacy and exposure to written language?
Yeah, such a great question. So my favorite researcher on this is Marianne Wolf, and she talks a lot about biliteracy and the biliterate reading brain. So not only are we learning how to handle text in print form, but also learning how to grapple with text in digital form. And students, like I said, there's a lot of recent research on this and it continues to evolve. But right now we're seeing students have both of these reading abilities, but not really knowing how to distinguish when they need to put more attention to text and engage in that deep reading that general print text has. When you're reading a text and you're going through that deep reading process, it's very laid out and scaffolded for you. Whereas we're used to the social media or even texting where it's much more direct and changes back and forth. So print text really allows for that deep reading, and students are really struggling with that deep reading when it comes to digital text right now. So we're seeing, especially in elementary schools, the importance of that print text so that we can really teach that deep reading process. There has been new research that continues to come out on this, but that's where we're at right now. We also know that attention span is playing a huge, huge factor. I'm sure you guys see as psychologists, people just want to write the script for attention medicine, but really we're seeing that have massive impacts in classrooms. The most recent study showed that attention is down by over 50% in the last few years. We're not shocked by that. Like every teacher is like, duh, but it helps us understand that our students are coming to us with lots of different complex demands. I look at my nephew. So I'm talking to him. He has a Netflix on the background. He's playing on his Switch. He's able to kind of handle all of this type of information, but not really able to focus on any of it. So we as teachers can really create more focused environments and kind of limit as much distraction as possible. There was a really cool study done with kindergarten, and they found that students who were largely learning in a very limited, bare-walled classroom outperformed students who had the typical, classroom decor. And you guys know what I'm talking about. I had it too, the lantern, the anchor charts, the this, that. But students were distracted, and it became another thing for them to kind of gaze off their attention.
Megan, I want to jump back for a second. When you were talking about kind of this idea of the strive for five and this dialogue piece, I found that kind of interesting in the sense of, we oftentimes hear about parents reading to their kids. And if I am hearing you right, it's not just about reading to them. It's about really having a conversation with them about what was just read. Like that takes it to another level. Am I understanding that the right way?
You are absolutely correct. So yes, we want everyone to be reading to their kids, but we want them to engage in that rich dialogue to understand what is happening in the story and ask, you might ask the child you're reading the story, what happened to the character? And they might tell you, I don't know. So rather than just moving on, you could provide a scaffolded response. Well, did the character go to the mall or did the character go to the park? And you can really engage. I was just reading this book today, so you can really engage in those conversations as well. And that really helps students to have the language skills needed. So one of the most annoying phrases I hear is we read to learn you learn to read, then you read to learn. And that kind of drives me nuts because it has this notion that students aren't learning all the time. And they really are, just because literacy development is still happening doesn't mean language development isn't happening as well. So we want to engage students, just because they're reading words like cat, bat, and hat doesn't mean I'm not engaging them in a very rich conversation about the War of 1812 or things of that nature. If you see a lot of these knowledge building curriculums in pre-K kindergarten, they are engaging in some extremely intelligent concepts. And when I first started teaching that way, I was in co-teaching with a kindergarten teacher at Cumberland Valley. And I was like, there is no way these kids are going to be able to get this. And not only did they get it, but they were making connections at recess and then talking to their parents about it. They couldn't read the word season, but in a conversation, they were able to understand that we can season our food or it could be a different season outside. One of the students was learning about spring, back to seasons. And they learned that spring isn't just a season, but I can have a spring in my step or a spring in a gadget, in a pen, things like that. So it's really engaging in that rich language. And I think that's really missing in a lot of these conversations when it comes to literacy development. People think it's just phonics instruction, and it's really not. It's also that rich language conversation that does start at home.
Right. I mean, it builds that foundation that when they can read the words, then they can actually take it to the next level. So I think it's important. I think I always say, I don't think we give kids enough credit for what they can have conversations about. And I've been in classrooms similar to what you described you were in. And it's fascinating. I mean, they have kindergarten kids talking about things that I never would have expected they would have had conversations on. And it's awesome. Like, it's awesome to watch and how they connect the dots and, how they can then use that information later. It's, I think important for parents as well.
Yeah, I think of one of my kiddos that I was teaching an intervention. He was considered a child who received tier 3 services. So as we know in the MTSS world or RTI world, that means he got core instruction and he also got support in a small group in reading as well as individualized one-on-one support. So this child had everything, every service we had was given to this kiddo. And, it was amazing that we think about, wow, he has such struggles with that word recognition. But then that was the child talking to me about his auditory processing and his senses that he learned in a unit. And I was just blown away at that rich oral language. I'm like, wow, these letter identification, this is a pothole that we're going to fill for you, because once you got this, just like you said, Ray, we are going to be rolling when it comes to that language development. And we want to keep that going, because the worst thing would be we taught a child all these great phonics patterns and morpheme patterns, and then they encounter text and they read it like crazy, but have no idea what's going on. So we're building that language along the way to support that.
And I can't help but think about how, like, teachers communicating with parents and how there's this it seems like this divide of either I'm going to treat and talk to my children as adults, or I'm going to filter out so much content that I'm only engaging with them in what I think that they should be interested in, or only what I think is appropriate for them. And it's really not the content that we should be filtering. It's the process in which it's being communicated and displayed to them. So that way, when they have these skills, they're able to then engage with it more actively, rather than they're having to develop all these skills, exactly as you're saying, but then it's almost kind of like a content route, where they're not then able to have a process or an avenue of using it and exploring it. And I love in sessions working with individuals, and I'm always a fan of the term cultivating curiosity. And in part of that, we need exposure to these different concepts and ideas to then be curious about them. And I hear that that's what you're doing when you talk about the War of 1812, or developing the language around this individual's auditory processing. It's more curiosity that they can say, well, how do I learn more? How do I know more?
You are absolutely right. And there's so much research that supports exactly what you said. When students don't know something, they're more naturally interested and curious to learn more, which is why the Knowledge Matters campaign has lists of really great curricula that do this, where we really see, if they're talking about the War of 1812 in kindergarten, how does that align through first, second, third grade as they're learning about wars that have happened? So when they get to middle school, they have all of this contextualized knowledge so that they can really handle the newest topic they're learning. I love how you said cultivating curiosity, because one of my favorite books that I just read is Cultivating Genius. And this is really looking at it from a historically responsive lens and helping students find their identity within school. And it's a really great read too. So I'm always reading, guys. I used to hate reading. Now I can't stop.
That's right. That's it. That's what happens. I always say I was the same way. I never enjoyed reading until I started learning about psychology, and then learning about reading itself. And then now I read more than I'm same as you. I have books everywhere. So
you guys find though, we sit here and have all these conversations, but your work in schools with psychology, do you find that schools have the effective materials to be able to deliver this instruction, or are teachers kind of left to their own devices?
Yeah, I think that's the hard part. I think it really depends on the school. And I think one thing I've learned in my career is that schools that are neighboring each other can have very different resources on what's available. And that's sad. I mean, I think that it's, so when you mentioned earlier about legislation being passed, I think that's what's going to be really important, to try to get the resources in the hands of teachers. I find that teachers go into teaching for a passion, and that passion gets burnt out because, as you kind of mentioned earlier, some maybe didn't have the right training. Some have the training and don't have the resources. And I think we need a mechanism to give them both. And if we do that, I think it changes the trajectory of what we're seeing in not only reading, I think academics in general, and in mental health. I mean, many kids we see in therapy, it's academic. They're struggling at school because, maybe they're not reading well. So they avoid reading out loud. And then somebody makes fun of them because they didn't read out loud, which then makes them not want to do it more. And then it's just this cycle. And I think it has to start with putting things in the hands of teachers that are beneficial. And, I always say I'm lucky. I buy a ton of books, and thank goodness for Kindle subscriptions and audiobooks and all of these things. So they're easily accessible, but I'm not sure everybody has those resources. So I think the more we can put those kind of books that you're talking about in the hands of teachers, I think it'd be a great outcome.
I totally agree. And the training, teachers barely have time to eat lunch these days, especially during COVID. I know teachers were giving up lunches and preps left and right, but we really want to make sure they're focusing on instructional prepping rather than writing their own curriculum. I don't even know how to write a curriculum. I have my doctorate and I can't write a curriculum. We wouldn't be able to sit here and brainstorm it. There's so many researchers who figure out all of those quantifiable text features and things. It's something I couldn't just Google and hope that it aligned to fourth grade. It really does require just robust materials. Ray, I couldn't agree with you more. It's sad to see that from 5 miles away, totally different instruction happening for that child based on their zip code or where their house is. It's a big problem.
Yeah. And I've been in school districts that in the same district, 2 schools doing things differently. And, I hope that this movement moves forward because I think it's going to make a huge difference. And, and in that, I guess maybe kind of moving into kind of another area here, what are the implications if we don't? So what are the long-term implications if we don't fix the illiteracy problem?
Yeah. So, we're living them now. The Barbara Bush Foundation said that if we fix this, we would have on average $1 trillion more in our economy. But really, it's immense. We're seeing dropout rates of 1 in 3 students right now are dropping out of school, and it's almost always related to reading. I don't remember the specific study, but they looked at 4th grade state testing scores, and it almost directly correlated to their high school dropout rates. Those same students who scored that below basic or struggled then, it almost directly correlated, which is a huge, huge concern. If we don't fix this, these are those students who we are going to see as they become adults. That one mom that I talked to who fortunately was able to get her job, she's one of the lucky ones because these are the people with poor employment opportunities. They're the ones most likely on welfare and struggling to get by. There was just a really huge thing done in the federal prison system and found that half of our prisoners were at about a 1st grade reading level. We're looking at higher incarceration rates. We're looking at a lot of misuse of prescriptions. Ray, you and I have that friend, Dr. Shaw, and Dr. Shaw told me that he used to sit on a board for organ donation and organ transplant. And one of the factors to determine whether or not a child would receive an organ was the parent's reading ability. And I was like, why? And he said, well, then they're more likely to follow the prescriptions and the medications if they had that reading ability. So when you think about, that's an organ, transplant. That blew my mind when he shared that with me. But we're really looking at higher incarceration, lower living, even lower life expectancy for those who struggle with reading. Those students that are struggling in reading in our class, they grow up. They can't just get shuffled grade to grade. We've got so much work to do because we don't want to continue to contribute to this massive problem, that I shared with you on that gap map. We've got a lot of work to do. And a lot of it comes not only with making sure our students receive the right instruction, but our teachers receive the right instruction. You guys are psychologists. You know that learning styles and auditory learning and stuff has been debunked a bajillion years ago. But over 40% of college prep programs are still teaching teachers that's there and important. They're still teaching kids to look away from the word and look at the picture instead of actually reading the word in front of them, even though we have eye movement studies that debunk that. So there's so much contradictory practices. So not only do our students need that instruction, but those who have the honor of teaching those kids day in and day out need that instruction as well, so that they know how to help their kids succeed.
It's interesting. When you mentioned about the incarceration rate. So I started my career working in a prison, and that's what I experienced was that many individuals couldn't even sign their name. The interesting part is after a few years they could. That the instruction in prison was actually at such a high level that many people learned to read during their incarceration. And part of me was like, wow, that's a little too late, right? We're like, if we want to talk about prevention, these aren't people that could not learn to read. I think that's the piece. They just didn't have the opportunity when they were younger. And many of them, reading, became a real resource for them to get through the day sometimes. And they became excellent readers. And some ended up going on and finishing high school. But I hope we never teach reading in prison again. I think it's like we shouldn't be. That's not where it should be happening. But it was fascinating. It's actually, I tell the story all the time. It was inmates that got me into school psychology. It wasn't, that I thought I was going to stay in there. And then their comments were, no, I didn't. I needed the help when I was 7 or 8. I didn't need the help when I'm here. So yeah, it's interesting that there's a lot of ramifications.
Yeah, you just shared, and same with my story. We got into it because we, saw the remediation side of it. But one of my favorite students actually just testified, in front of the House and Senate with her. Her name is Penelope. I absolutely love this little kiddo, but her brother struggled with reading, and she was one of the lowest performing readers I had ever had. And we targeted her, gave her all the services. We gave her everything in our tool belt. And today we talk about an amazing example of prevention. She's one of the top readers in her 4th grade class. And, thankfully received structured literacy instruction, amazing instruction at Middlesex Elementary with a great team. And now she's not going to be one of those statistics. She's not going to be sitting in intervention or on an IEP or a 504 plan that could have been prevented. And I think that's what's frustrating. We're seeing climbing numbers of IEPs. Our school psychologists are the busiest people I know because they're writing all of these IEPs, and a lot of it comes from a lack of instruction in the first place. We really could have prevented a lot of these effects.
Yeah. It's it's definitely interesting work, and I think it's something we have to keep doing. And I'm just going to throw out a kudos. I actually just saw you online testifying in front of Congress or Senate, which I was like, and it was funny because you just kind of popped up on my feed and you were there. And I was like, oh, that's really awesome that you're doing that work. So, it's great that you're doing that advocacy in addition to helping kids learn to read. So it's
gotta help those kids. It's all for those kids. When you see those kids succeeding and you're seeing schools with 90 and 95% proficiency rates, you're not just looking at a school with great test scores, but you're looking at a community that is now going to benefit from that amazing instruction and those amazing students. You're going to look at the next generation of doctors and neuroscientists, astronauts, because they can do anything if they have that ability to read. 100%.
That's right. So Megan, as we kind of wrap up, we like to kind of end with doing some takeaways. And one of the things that we're interested in is, we're the Psych to Practice podcast. So we're interested in what keeps you psyched to do what you do.
Oh, so it is always going back to the kids, the students I've had the honor of serving, the amazing teachers I've co-taught with and learned from. And I think right now, today, I work at the AIM Institute for Learning and Research. It's an amazing research and professional learning conglomerate, taking over like all over the country. But it started with 2 moms. And they are my huge motivations. They met because their 6-year-old daughters had dyslexia and were sitting in a school system that was failing them. So they were like, we're going to start our own school, screw it. And started their own school, had no idea what they were doing, but always went to the research and went to the conferences and figured it out. And today we have Yale and all these amazing, Stanford is actually doing an active study. Florida Center for Reading Research is in our school working with our kids and teachers outside of Philadelphia, and just seeing how their passion has led to this amazing work just continues to inspire me as well. If you ever have an opportunity to be in Conshohocken and visit our students at AIM Academy, they are absolutely brilliant. Students that had come to us because public school wasn't working for them or their current school system wasn't working. Some kids are traveling over 2 hours by car to come to this school. But what they're able to produce and exceed a lot of those instructional targets is just, it's unbelievable. You got to come check it out.
Awesome. Awesome. And you've already given us a ton of resources that, people can use, but I guess if you could recommend kind of one piece of content, whether it's a book, a movie, TV show, what's one thing you would suggest people look into?
Yeah. So, I don't just look at literacy in the lens of our profession. We, just because we're teachers doesn't mean we're not working with psychologists as well as everyone else in our community. And probably my favorite community-centered resource is the Right to Read documentary, because it looks at reading not just in test scores and things that we were just talking about on this call, but really that societal view and how we can really help our kids and where we've been historically and where we could go. So there's a lot of showings of that documentary that are around. There's been a lot locally in Harrisburg as well as all over the country. So I encourage everyone to check it out. I know anytime I have a conversation with a non-educator and I get them to go to that documentary screening or see it online, they're always like, I had no idea that the state of education was this bad.
Yeah. Is there a way that they can view it online, or it's not?
Yeah, so there's showings and there's screenings of it. I don't know if you can access it directly online, but there's always organizations that are doing screenings. So, just go on X or LinkedIn. I'm sure you could find something.
Okay. And then last thing is we always like to hear if you could give kind of 3 takeaways or gems that you've learned in your career that would be things that you could pass on to maybe other people entering education or mental health. What are 3 takeaways you would have? Yeah.
So first and foremost, follow the evidence. I mean, evidence doesn't lie. IES practice guides that you can get online are amazing resources for psychologists, teachers, and families that tell you what good instruction is like. And they synthesized all of the crazy research talk for us. So I love to say, follow the evidence, not just cool people you like online, not just one specific curriculum, but follow the evidence. Second, I would say be flexible and teachable. Yeah, Ray, I met you with Dr. Shaw, who's a psychologist. Mm-hmm. I didn't even realize I loved psychology until my conversations with you and him and just seeing the ramifications and the intersections of our work. So I have so much to learn from you guys and from your community here on this podcast. And I encourage all teachers and all psychologists to just be open to that conversation and be very teachable, just like we want our students to be. And I think the most important thing, anytime I'm anywhere talking, whether it be at a Capitol or teaching a lesson for students, I think the most important thing to recognize in our work is our impact. Recognize that for a child, we can be everything. We can be that thing that gets them through, that school day, that week, or even as I told you for Mr. Y, he is someone I think about every single week. And he's someone who taught me, 20 years ago. So just recognize the impact that we have not only on our students, but on our profession and each other, because we're doing really important work. We don't get paid for it, but we're doing some really important work out there.
Awesome. So Megan, thank you so much for joining us and talking about this important topic. And again, thanks for the work that you do. We really appreciate you taking time to share with us.
Of course. Thank you guys. And I'm happy to stay in touch. I know we're always BSing online, so I'm looking forward to it.
No, and I certainly I feel like I was coming into this conversation a bit in the dark, and now I have a plethora of resources, and both literary as well as some online resources to go and check out. So certainly, thank you so much, Megan.
Thank you, Paul. And call me anytime. I got you. If I don't know anyone, I know someone who does.
And she really does. I email her all the time going, do you have an idea of this program or that program? And she always follows through. So appreciate it.
Certainly take you up on that offer. Well, and, Megan, with all the work that you're doing, is there any area or any place that our listeners can go to stay up to date and hearing about like the work that you're doing, as well as just the general progress in terms of, literary development, helping kids to read?
Yeah. So I am very active on X, Twitter for us old people. I still call it Twitter. But just at Megan Gierka. My last name is really weird, but Gierka. Always posting research and things on there. And it's probably the quickest way to get a hold of me. I also do a lot of active outreach work with my company. So at Aim to Learn. I think they're on Facebook too, the AIM Institute for Learning and Research. We just did a huge research to practice symposium on Monday, totally free access to get access to these great researchers I have the opportunity to work with every single day. So check out all those great resources. I am always an email or tweet away and happy to support anyone and engage in conversations on this work. It's so important.
I certainly hope our audience takes you up on that offer. If you're interested in hearing more or staying up to date with what's going on for the Psych to Practice podcast, you can visit our website at www.psychtopractice.com or follow us on all major social media by searching Psych to Practice. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but until then, be well and stay psyched. The information contained in this podcast and on the Psych to Practice website is intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional, psychological, psychiatric, educational, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no professional patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host, guests, and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of a mental health professional or practitioner, please contact services in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please locate a supervisor with experience to fit your professional needs.